Hello, listener. It's 11 p.m. in Alaska. It's been dark for 4 hours, and something is walking through that darkness toward a town of 28 people who have no way out. My name is David Morgan, KWAV 92.1 FM, Anchorage. I play music to a sleeping state on weeknights. Tonight, I'm not playing music, because 6 minutes ago, I heard something on the Alaska State Trooper Emergency Channel that made me go very still, and in the 9 minutes since then, my phone has not stopped ringing. Here's what I know at 11:04 p.m. A truck driver on the Parks Highway north of Wasilla stopped his vehicle because someone was walking in the middle of the road. November, Alaska, 11 at night. No coat. If you're from here, you already understand what that means. A person walking outside without a coat in Alaska in November at 11 p.m. is a person who is either already dying or is no longer a person in any way you have a word for. The driver stopped because that's what you do in Alaska when you see someone in trouble on a highway where the next building is 40 miles away. He rolled down his window. He called out. The person on the road turned around. The driver said 2 things to the state troopers before he stopped talking about what he saw. He said, the eyes were wrong. And he said, when it saw me, it ran toward the truck. Troopers reached the scene at 11:12 p.m., found the driver locked in his cab, found the road empty, found something in the snow at the tree line that they're not discussing on the open channel anymore, which is how I know it was bad enough to move to encrypted communication. I'm going to stay on this frequency all night. I'm going to tell you everything I know as fast as I know it. And I need you to stay with me, because what I'm about to describe is not just a highway incident north of Wasilla. At 11:07 p.m., I received 3 calls inside of 4 minutes. The first was from Wasilla. The second was from Palmer. The third was from Titna, which is a fishing and tourism community of approximately 28 permanent winter residents, 200 miles north of Anchorage on the Parks Highway, accessible by road. But that road at 11 p.m. in November has nothing on it except darkness, and whatever is currently walking through that darkness. The Titna caller said, David, there's a man in town who isn't right. He bit his neighbor, and his neighbor isn't right anymore either. 2 people, 28 total, 200 miles from the nearest hospital, 3 hours from any organized emergency response. And the only thing between that town and complete darkness is a frequency that reaches 200 miles in clear weather. At 11:10 p.m., I need to tell you something about Alaska before I tell you anything else. Because if you're not from here, you won't understand the geography of what's facing tonight. The state of Alaska contains 663,000 square miles of land. It has a total road system of approximately 14,000 miles, which means the vast majority of Alaska has no roads at all. 365 communities in this state are not connected to any road system. They are accessible by small plane in good weather, by boat in summer, by snowmobile in winter, if the terrain allows, and by nothing at all when the weather closes in, which in November in Alaska happens regularly, which in November in Alaska is happening right now across the northern part of the state, where a low-pressure system is producing winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour and visibility near zero. If something reaches those roadless communities tonight, nobody can respond. Not in any time frame that matters. The Alaska State Troopers have 11 posts covering the entire state. The Alaska National Guard has resources, but mobilizing them takes time that the communities don't have. And the darkness, the genuine total darkness of an Alaskan November night at interior latitudes, where civil twilight ended at 3:44 this afternoon, the darkness is not a metaphor or an atmospheric detail. It is a physical condition that changes every calculation about movement, visibility, and survival. Whatever is walking through Alaska tonight is walking through the darkest, coldest, most isolated landscape in the United States. And so is everyone trying to survive it. At 11:13 p.m., Ryan Callahan came on the line from Titna. Ryan is 42 years old, retired state wildlife officer, has lived in Titna for 11 years. His voice has the specific flatness of someone who has spent enough time in dangerous situations that panic stopped being a useful response a long time ago. He said, "David, I need you to relay information because the trooper line is overwhelmed and I can't get through." I said, "Go ahead, Ryan." He said, "The man who started this is Earl Briggs, 61 years old, has lived here 17 years. Earl showed up at his neighbor Pete Svensson's door at approximately 10:40 p.m. acting confused and aggressive. Pete tried to help him inside and Earl bit him on the forearm. Pete's wife Carol called me because I'm the closest thing to emergency services this town has at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. I got to Pete's place at 10:56 p.m. Pete's fever came on in less than 10 minutes after the bite. I have Pete and Carol locked in their back room right now, and I'm outside their door, and Pete doesn't sound like Pete anymore, and he hasn't for the past 6 minutes. Ryan, where is Earl right now?" He said, "That's the problem, David. I don't know." At 11:16 p.m., I want to say something to every person listening right now across Alaska and wherever else this signal reaches. If you are in a small community tonight, if you are in one of Alaska's roadless villages or in a highway town that is hours from any organized response, I need you to do something right now before I continue. I need you to account for everyone in your immediate vicinity. Not tomorrow, right now. Because what started on the Parks Highway and in Titna in the past hour is not staying there. The calls coming into this station are already covering a geographic range that tells me this started before tonight. And the people who were exposed before tonight are somewhere in Alaska right now, and most of them don't know what they're carrying. I'll be back with Ryan in 60 seconds. But first, if this broadcast is reaching you and you're somewhere alone tonight, call in. The number is on your radio dial. We are tracking every location that calls in because every location matters, and nobody in Alaska should be invisible tonight. At 11:19 p.m., 3 more calls logged in the past 4 minutes. Trapper Creek, 60 miles south of Titna on the Parks Highway. Big Lake on the west side of the Matsu Valley. And 1 call that made Jake Peterson, my engineer who showed up at the station at 11:08 p.m. because he heard the broadcast begin and understood immediately what it was going to be, made Jake go very quiet and hand me the note without saying anything out loud. The note said, "Kotzebue. Caller won't give name. Says it started there yesterday. Kotzebue is above the Arctic Circle. Population of 3,300 people, predominantly Inupiaq Alaska Native. Accessible year-round by air only. No road connection to anywhere. If the outbreak reached Kotzebue yesterday, and we're only hearing about it now, that's a full day of spread in an isolated Arctic community with no road out and weather that is currently preventing air traffic." At 11:22 p.m., the shape of tonight just changed. I'm David Morgan. This is KWAV 92.1 FM, and Alaska is going to need this frequency to be on all night. Stay here. Don't go anywhere. Because Ryan Callahan is still on hold, and Pete Svensson's door is still holding, and somewhere in Titna, Earl Briggs is walking through the dark. Ryan came back on at 11:25 p.m. Pete's door was still holding. He said the sounds from the back room had changed, gotten quieter, which he said was not reassuring because in his experience with dangerous animals, quiet after noise meant something had shifted from agitation to focus. He said Carol was pressed against the far wall of the back room, talking to Pete in a low voice. And Pete was responding sometimes with words, and sometimes with sounds that weren't words. And Ryan said he had his hand on the door handle and he was making a decision. "Ryan, what's the door situation? What's between you and that back room?" He said, "Standard interior door, hollow core. Wouldn't stop much. But there's a heavy bookshelf in the hallway I haven't moved yet. I'm deciding whether moving it means I've made a decision I can't unmake. I told him, move the shelf. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then I heard scraping. He said, okay, it's moved. David, I need you to understand something about this town that I don't think anyone outside Alaska understands. Titna in November has 12 permanent residents right now. The rest are seasonal. Of those 12, I've got Pete and Carol in that back room. Earl is somewhere I don't know, and the remaining 9 are distributed across a town that's about 2 miles end to end with no streetlights beyond the main strip. I cannot reach all of them. I can protect maybe 2 or 3 in whatever position one establish. The math here is very bad. I hear you, Ryan. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to keep this line open. You're my ears in Titna, and I'm your connection to everything outside it. Every piece of information that comes into this station about what we're dealing with, you hear at the same time Alaska does. And whatever you need me to relay to emergency services, I'll relay it, because you're right that the trooper line is overwhelmed, and we are what's available right now. He said, fair enough. Then he said, David, Pete just stopped making noise entirely. At 11:29 p.m., the Alaska State Troopers issued their first public statement. It was brief and used careful language and said approximately nothing useful, which is not a criticism of the troopers, but an acknowledgement that at 11:29 p.m., the troopers were dealing with a situation that their training had not specifically covered, and their public communication was reflecting that uncertainty. The statement said, Alaska State Troopers are responding to multiple reports of violent incidents along the Parks Highway corridor and in the Mat-Su Valley. Residents are advised to remain indoors, secure their residences, and contact 911 for emergencies. Further updates will be provided as information becomes available. What the statement did not say. What was causing the violent incidents? What the statement did not say. That 911 was running at 3 times normal call volume. What the statement did not say, that the Parks Highway had a confirmed incident the troopers classified on encrypted channel as Priority 1 biological event, which is a classification that Jake told me he'd been monitoring trooper communications for 12 years in Alaska and had never once heard used. At 11:32 p.m., I need to tell you what the midnight temperature in Anchorage is tonight, because temperature is going to be a significant part of this story. And I want you to understand the baseline. 11 degrees Fahrenheit in the city. In the Parks Highway corridor north of Wasilla, it's -4. In Titna, it's -7. Above the Arctic Circle in Kotzebue, it is currently -21, with wind chill bringing effective temperature to -44. These are not background details. These are the most important numbers of tonight, because whatever is driving this outbreak, whatever pathogen is turning people into what the truck driver saw on the Parks Highway, it exists in biology. And biology has limits in the cold. The question, and Dr. Sarah McIntosh from UAA's Department of Biological Sciences called the station at 11:30 p.m. and is holding on Jake's board right now. The question is what those limits are, and whether the cold is Alaska's weapon tonight, the same way Arizona's heat was someone else's weapon on a different terrible day. Dr. McIntosh, you're on the air. She said, David, based on what I'm hearing described, this matches a prion cascade pattern that a colleague in infectious disease shared with me 3 weeks ago from a series of case reports out of interior Alaska that were classified as bear attack anomalies at the time. I've been looking at those case reports since 11 p.m., and I don't think they were bear attacks. I think we've been watching the beginning of this for 3 weeks and classifying it incorrectly because the symptoms in early stages look like standard trauma. I asked her, what does the cold do to it? She said, prion propagation requires functional cellular machinery. At the cellular level, extreme cold slows those mechanisms dramatically. Not the same as killing the prion. The misfolded proteins are extraordinarily durable, but cold slows the cascade significantly. An infected individual in -21 degrees Fahrenheit is experiencing rapid cellular shutdown from hypothermia simultaneously with the prion progression. The two processes are competing. In that competition, the cold wins faster than the prion does. But the prion doesn't die. It waits. I asked, "How long does it wait?" She said, "Indefinitely, David. Prions are among the most stable biological structures we know of. A frozen infected individual is not a dead infected individual. They're a paused one." I broadcast that and let it sit for a moment, because it needed to sit. At 11:36 p.m., Ryan came back on. Pete's door opened. He said it quietly, the way people describe things they can't quite believe they're describing. He said, "The door opened and Carol came out first. She's uninjured. She got past him somehow. She's not saying how yet. She's not saying much of anything yet. She's with me in the kitchen now. Pete is in the back room, and the door is closed again, and I've moved the bookshelf back. Ryan, Carol, listen to me. Carol needs to tell us everything she can about the timeline. When Pete was bitten, when he stopped being Pete, how fast it moved." Carol's voice came on the line at 11:38 p.m. Quiet and precise the way shock sometimes makes people, the kind of forced clarity that happens when emotion is too large to fit in the available space and everything has to be processed in small, exact pieces. She said, "Earl bit Pete at 10:43 p.m. I know the time because I looked at the clock when it happened, because that's what I do when something is wrong. I look at the clock. By 10:52, Pete had a fever. By 10:58, he stopped using complete sentences. By 11:04, he was entirely not Pete. 21 minutes. From bite to complete transition in 21 minutes. Dr. McIntosh is still on the line, and she heard Carol. She said, "That's faster than most reported timelines. The cold may actually be accelerating the initial cascade before it slows the later stages. The onset is faster in cold because the body's stress response to cold temperatures amplifies the prion's initial propagation rate. The degradation and immobility come faster too, but the window between bite and transition is shorter, much shorter in these temperatures. 21 minutes and -7-degree weather. That's what Titna is working with." At 11:41 p.m., and I want to be honest with you about this, because you deserve honesty, we have confirmed reports of this spreading beyond the park's highway corridor. Jake has been running our tip line while I broadcast, and the calls are covering a geographic range that I'm going to describe, and I need you to hear it without panic, because panic gets people killed in Alaska faster than almost anything else. Confirmed incident reports as of 11:41 p.m. Parks Highway north of Vizilla, Titna, Trapper Creek, the Big Lake, Sutton on the Glen Highway east of Palmer, and the unconfirmed report from Kotzebue above the Arctic Circle that I mentioned earlier. Additionally, 2 calls from Anchorage itself, both from areas near the port of Anchorage on the Ship Creek waterfront, both describing individuals showing the aggressive behavior in that vicinity. The port of Anchorage, Alaska's primary commercial port, through which 90% of all goods consumed in Alaska arrive. If this reached the port through maritime shipping or port workers, the distribution network for Alaska becomes a distribution network for the outbreak, and every small community that received a supply shipment in the past week potentially received something else with it. At 11:44 p.m., I want every listener in Alaska to hear something from Ryan Callahan, because Ryan is the most useful voice on this frequency right now, and what he's about to tell you is the most practically important thing you're going to hear tonight. Ryan, talk to me about what you're doing right now, not what you're afraid of, what you're actually doing. He said, "I'm doing what you do in Alaska when something goes wrong that you can't outrun. You stop trying to outrun it, and you start managing your immediate environment. I've got Carol. I've got a wood stove that can heat this place for 2 days on the wood that's already inside. I've got food for a week. I've got a rifle and 300 rounds because this is Alaska, and that's just what you have. I've got a satellite communicator that can send and receive texts even when cell is down. And I've got you on the radio. That's what I've got. So that's what I'm working with. That's Alaska. That's exactly Alaska. At 11:47 p.m., the question I haven't asked yet, because there hasn't been a moment where the answer would have helped more than asking it costs. The question I'm asking now because we're 43 minutes into this broadcast, and you've stayed with me, and you deserve everything I have. Where did this start? The case reports Dr. McIntosh mentioned 3 weeks ago. Interior Alaska. Bear attack anomalies. Jake has been pulling those reports while I broadcast. He's got 4 of them. All from the same geographic cluster. All from communities within 80 miles of the Denali borough line. All involving victims who survived initial attacks and then attacked others within minutes. All classified as wildlife encounters because in Alaska, strange violent incidents in remote areas default to wildlife as the explanatory category. The last of those reports was filed 11 days ago from a community called Cantwell, population 34, on the Parks Highway, 50 miles south of Titna. Ryan, he said, I know where Cantwell is, David. I know you do. Is there anyone in Titna right now who came from Cantwell in the past 2 weeks? The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Then Ryan said, Earl Briggs has a brother in Cantwell. Stay on this frequency, because we just found the beginning of the thread, and I'm going to follow it all the way back to where this started. And Alaska is going to hear every step of it. Jake pulled Earl Briggs's brother at 11:52 p.m. Name is Martin Briggs, 58 years old, has lived in Cantwell for 23 years. Jake found a local community board post from 9 days ago asking if anyone had seen Martin because he hadn't come into the general store in 4 days, which in a community of 34 people is the equivalent of vanishing. The post had 2 replies, both saying they hadn't seen him, and then nothing after that, because in small Alaska communities, when someone vanishes, there is a moment of community concern, and then the community either finds them or accepts that the land took them, because the land takes people in Alaska and always has. Martin Briggs disappeared 9 days ago. His brother Earl showed up in Talkeetna tonight, not wearing a coat, walking in the dark, not responding to language, and biting people. At 11:54 p.m., Dr. McIntosh said something that I want you to hear carefully because it changes the timeline we've been working with. She said, if Martin Briggs was the index case in Cantwell 9 days ago, and if Earl Briggs was exposed during a visit to Cantwell sometime in that window, then Earl spent a period of time between exposure and full transition that is significantly longer than the 21 minutes Carol described for Pete. She said, that suggests either exposure level affects progression rate, or there is an incubation window in early exposure where the prion is propagating slowly before reaching a threshold that triggers the acute phase. She said, if the latter is true, there are people in Alaska right now who were exposed days ago and who have not yet entered the acute phase. They are walking around, they are on planes, they are in supply boats, they are in the communities they've always been in, and they don't know. The room I was sitting in got very quiet when she said that. Jake stopped typing. I looked at the clock. 11:55 p.m. She said, the Kotzebue report. If someone called you saying, it started there yesterday, and Kotzebue has no road connection and limited air traffic. The question is how it reached Kotzebue in the first place. And the answer is almost certainly the same way everything reaches Kotzebue. A person on a plane who felt slightly off during the flight and attributed it to the altitude, or the stress, or just Alaska in November, landed in Kotzebue, went home, and then, sometime yesterday, entered the acute phase. At 11:58 p.m., I'm going to be direct with you about something, because direct is what tonight requires. If you are somewhere in Alaska right now, and you have been in contact in the past 2 weeks with anyone from the Denali borough area, anyone from the Parks Highway communities, anyone who traveled through interior Alaska in the past 3 weeks, I need you to assess yourself and everyone with you. Not because I'm telling you you're infected, because the window between exposure and acute phase may be days rather than minutes. And the people who need to know that are the people who don't yet know anything is wrong. Do you have a headache that started in the past few days that you've been attributing to the dry winter air? Do you have a fever that you've been calling a cold? Has anyone in your household been more irritable than normal? More confused? Responding more slowly than usual? I'm not trying to cause panic. I'm trying to give you the information that helps you make better decisions than you would make without it. At midnight exactly, Ryan updated me from Titna. He'd made contact through text with 4 of the remaining 9 residents he hadn't yet accounted for. 3 of them were home and secure. One of them, a seasonal worker named Joe Mackey, who'd been staying in town past his usual departure date because of a mechanical issue with his truck, wasn't answering texts or his door when a neighbor knocked. The neighbor's name is Gladys Thornton, 69 years old, 40-year Titna resident, who Ryan described as the kind of woman who has survived enough Alaskan winters that she approaches danger with the same attitude she approaches everything else in this landscape. Complete pragmatic respect for what it can do, combined with absolute refusal to be more afraid of it than necessary. Gladys knocked on Joe's door at 11:58 p.m. and got no answer. She said the light was on inside. She said she could hear movement. She said the movement didn't sound right. Ryan told her to go home and lock her door, and she told Ryan she'd been locking her door against Alaskan nights since before he was born and didn't need the reminder. At 12:04 a.m., the Alaska National Guard issued its activation notice. Governor's order, all available units. The initial deployment is targeted at Anchorage, the Matsu Valley Corridor, an air bridge establishment to Kotzebue. Timeline for Guard presence in Anchorage, 90 minutes. Timeline for air assets reaching the park's highway communities, 2 to 3 hours depending on weather. Timeline for reaching Kotzebue. The weather window above the Arctic Circle is currently closed and is forecast to remain closed until at least 4 a.m., which means Kotzebue is on its own until at least 4 a.m. and likely longer. 3,300 people above the Arctic Circle. Weather closed. Help at minimum 4 hours away. At 12:07 a.m., the Kotzebue caller came back. He'd been off the line for 50 minutes, and when he came back, he was willing to give his name. Thomas Akiruk, 44 years old, works as a maintenance coordinator for the Kotzebue School District. He said he'd been listening to the broadcast on his phone, and he decided that whatever protective anonymity he thought he was maintaining by not giving his name was less important than being a useful information source. And Thomas Akiruk was going to be useful. He said, "David, I'm going to tell you what Kotzebue looks like right now, and I need you to believe me when I say that we are managing. Alaska Native communities have been managing isolation and crisis without outside help since long before there was outside help. And Kotzebue is not sitting here waiting to be saved. But we do need information, and we do need connection, and that's what you can give us. Thomas, tell me what you've got." He said, "The initial incident occurred at the airport 36 hours ago. A cargo flight came in from Fairbanks with 2 passengers, which is normal. Cargo flights in Alaska carry passengers regularly. One of those passengers became acutely ill in the terminal. By the time anyone understood what was happening, 3 terminal staff had been bitten. The terminal has been locked down, and those 3 staff members are contained. But what I can tell you is that the passenger from Fairbanks who started this arrived on a flight that also stopped in Galena, McGrath, and Aniak before reaching us. I don't know what state those communities are in right now. I can't reach them. The radio contact I have is you." At 12:11 a.m., Jake wrote on his notepad and slid it to me. Galena Pop 470, McGrath Pop 300, Aniak Pop 500, all roadless, all served by the same cargo route. I looked at that note for 2 seconds, and then I looked at the clock And then I looked at Jake, and Jake said quietly, if those communities were hit 36 hours ago, and we don't know yet, the picture is much larger than the park's highway. I broadcast it, all of it, because the people in those communities, if any of them are listening on whatever radio they have, deserve to know that we know they're out there. And the people in communities across Alaska who might be connected to those cargo routes deserve to know the scope of what's moving through their state tonight. At 12:15 a.m., I want to do something that I've been thinking about since the broadcast began and that I'm going to be straight with you about, because straight is the only thing this frequency is dealing in tonight. If you've been with us since 11 p.m., if you've been listening to Ryan and Carol and Thomas and Dr. McIntosh and Jake working through this in real time, if this broadcast has been the thing keeping you connected to something larger than the dark outside your window, then I want you to know what this station is and why it matters that it's here. KWAV is a local Alaska station. We're not a network affiliate with a crisis team on standby. We're Jake, who drove here at 11 p.m. because he heard the broadcast start and understood immediately that I was going to need an engineer tonight. We're a frequency that reaches across the state because Alaska needs frequencies that reach across the state. If this broadcast helps you survive tonight, please remember that local radio exists because communities support it. Hit subscribe on our YouTube channel if you're watching this later. Leave a comment telling us where in Alaska or where in the world you're listening from right now, because tonight of all nights, I want to know who we're reaching. And if you want to support us beyond that, the link for our Buy Me a Coffee page is in the comments below, because Jake and I are going to be here all night, and coffee is going to be a significant part of that. Support the thing that shows up when things go wrong. That's all I'll say about that. At 12:19 a.m., Ryan's satellite communicator received a text from an unknown number. He read it to me word for word. It said, "This is Martin Briggs, Earl's brother. I'm in the woods south of Titna. I've been here for 6 days. I don't know exactly what I am right now, but I know I'm not safe to be around people. Is there someone I can talk to who can help me understand what's happening to me?" The line went very quiet. Ryan said, "David, Martin Briggs is alive, and he's been in the woods in Alaska in November for 6 days in -7 degrees, and he just sent a coherent text message." I said, "What does that tell us?" He said, "It tells us the cold is doing something to the progression. It's slowing it down. He should be fully transitioned based on what we know about the timeline. He's not. He's cold and he's scared, and he's thinking clearly enough to reach out." Dr. McIntosh on the other line said, with the particular intensity of a scientist who has just seen data that rewrites everything, "David, get that man on the phone right now." Martin Briggs called in at 12:23 a.m. His voice was rough in the way that 6 days outside in Alaska makes a voice rough. The kind of cold, deep hoarseness that goes beyond the throat into the chest, and he spoke slowly, choosing words with the deliberateness of someone whose thoughts were coming through a medium that wasn't quite as clear as it should be. But they were coming. Complete sentences. Self-awareness. The ability to recognize that he needed to reach out rather than act on whatever other impulses were competing with that recognition. He said, "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I want to say that first, because I think it needs to be said first." I said, "Martin, we're listening. Dr. Sarah McIntosh from UA is on the line. She's an infectious disease researcher, and she needs to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" He said it was okay. Dr. McIntosh said, "Martin, I need to understand your timeline. When were you first exposed, and what has happened to your condition over the past 9 days?" He said, "I was at my cabin when it started. An animal came out of the tree line, not behaving like any animal I've seen in 23 years up here. Moving wrong, eyes wrong. It attacked me, bit my left forearm before I could get inside. I thought it was a sick wolf. I have a medical kit. I cleaned the wound. I was going to radio out in the morning. But by morning, I wasn't thinking right. I knew I wasn't thinking right, and that scared me enough to stay away from people. I walked south into the timber instead of toward town. I've been in the timber since. Dr. McIntosh said, "Martin, you said you weren't thinking right. Can you describe what that means?" He said, "There were periods where I wanted to go toward lights and sounds. Strong urge, like hunger, but not for food. I understood what it was, because I've been listening to radios in the backcountry for 20 years, and I've heard enough about this kind of thing to recognize what was happening to me. In the cold, and I mean deep cold, -15, -20, those periods got shorter, cleaner gaps in between. Right now, I'm sitting in a snow shelter I built 3 days ago, and I'd call my clarity about 60% of what it normally is. 60% isn't 100%, but it's enough to know I shouldn't be around people, and it's enough to make this call." At 12:27 a.m., Dr. McIntosh said something that changed everything, and I want to give you this exactly as she said it. She said, "Martin, what you're describing suggests that extreme cold is doing something more complex than simply slowing the progression. It's creating cyclical windows of suppressed acute behavior, probably by reducing the metabolic rate to a level where prion propagation slows dramatically. You are experiencing the infection in a modified form because your core temperature has been chronically suppressed. You are not immune, but you are in a cold-induced partial suppression state that is unlike anything in the documented literature on this pathogen. And if we can understand the mechanism by which the cold is doing this to you, we may have the most important piece of information we're going to find tonight." She said, "David, I need to get Martin to a controlled cold environment where we can monitor him, not a hospital. A hospital is warm and warm will accelerate his acute phase. I need something cold, controlled, and isolated." I said, "Jake, what do we have in Titna that fits that description?" Jake said without hesitation, "The old fish processing station on the river. Seasonal operation. Empty in November. Unheated. Solid structure. 5 miles south of the town center." Ryan was already thinking it. He said, "I know that building. I can get there." At 12:31 a.m., the plan that formed in the next 4 minutes is the plan that the rest of tonight is going to run on. And I want to describe it clearly because it involves real people making dangerous decisions in Alaska in the middle of the night. And they deserve to have those decisions described accurately. Ryan Callahan, with Carol Svensson, is going to drive the 5 miles to the Titna fish processing station and prepare it for Martin Briggs. They'll bring the wood stove supplies that can heat one small interior room while leaving the main floor cold, creating a temperature-controlled environment where Martin can be observed without triggering the acute acceleration that warmth would cause. Martin is going to walk from his snow shelter to the fish station, which he estimates is 2 miles. He's going to do this alone because the risk of him encountering anyone who triggers his acute phase during the walk is something he's made clear he won't allow. Carol said she's coming with Ryan, and that was not a discussion. At 12:35 a.m., while Ryan and Carol were getting ready to move, Thomas Akurek came back on from Kotzebue. He said, "I've been doing what you asked and accounting for everyone I can reach. Kotzebue's community structure is tight in the way Alaska Native communities are tight, and I've got a network of 12 people doing wellness checks across the community. We've confirmed 261 people safe and sheltered of our approximately 3,300 total population. That leaves a significant unconfirmed number, but I want you to understand that unconfirmed in Kotzebue in November means people are asleep or their phone is dead or they're at a family member's house and didn't pick up. The actual incident number we're tracking is 11 confirmed. 11 people showing the acute behavior. The community has contained them in the community center's back storage area, which is the largest lockable space available, and the community is holding a perimeter. 3,300 people. 11 confirmed acute. A community holding its own perimeter above the Arctic Circle in -44. Wind chill while the weather keeps rescue 4 hours away. Thomas said, "We're okay, David. We've been here for thousands of years. We know what holding on looks like. At 12:39 a.m., the Port of Anchorage situation was updated by Jake, who had reached his contact at Anchorage PD's Marine Unit. 2 incidents on the Ship Creek waterfront had escalated to 4, involving dock workers from the night shift. Anchorage PD was managing with available units and had requested guard support. The port itself was locked down. No vessel movement authorized in or out, which meant the supply chain for Alaska was frozen at its primary intake point, which in practical terms means that whatever goods are currently in Alaska are what Alaska has, and resupply is suspended until the port can be cleared and secured. I broadcast that because people needed to know, and I followed it with the immediate practical guidance. If you have food and supplies, ration now. Not because we're facing weeks of this, but because the uncertainty about duration is reason enough to treat your existing supplies with care. Alaska knows how to prepare for isolation. Alaska has always known how to prepare for isolation. This is that knowledge being useful. At 12:43 a.m., I received a call that I wasn't expecting from a person I should have thought to call myself. And the reason I hadn't called her is that I was so deep in managing incoming information that I lost track of who else was out there managing their own situations. The caller was Dr. Elise Raven, who runs a medical clinic in Titna. Population 28, but Titna has a clinic because it's a staging community for Denali expeditions and has always needed basic medical capability. Dr. Raven had been at her clinic since 11 p.m. She'd heard the broadcast from a radio she keeps for exactly these situations, and she had been quietly preparing her clinic as a medical staging point while Ryan was managing the immediate incidents. She said, "David, I have a 12-bed capacity here if we need it. I have cold environment capability because this is a Denali staging clinic and we treat frostbite and hypothermia, which means I have controlled cooling capability that Dr. McIntosh's plan for Martin Briggs could use more effectively than an unheated fish processing station. I have medical monitoring equipment, and I have 14 years of wilderness medicine experience in Alaska that I haven't heard being used yet tonight." Dr. McIntosh said immediately, "Change the plan. Martin goes to the clinic. Can you maintain a cold zone, Dr. Raven? A controlled environment in the 40 to 50 degree range?" Dr. Raven said, "I can maintain it at 42. I have the equipment to do that." At 12:47 a.m., the plan changed, and the change mattered because the difference between monitoring Martin Briggs in an abandoned fish station and monitoring him in a climate-controlled clinic with a wilderness medicine physician is the difference between observing something and understanding it. And we needed to understand it. Ryan and Carol adjusted course. They're going to the clinic instead. Martin Briggs, in a snow shelter 2 miles south of Talkeetna, texted a thumbs up when Ryan relayed the change to his satellite communicator. A thumb-up emoji. From a man who's been in the Alaskan wilderness for 6 days in -7 degrees and who has been fighting something in his own biology that most people wouldn't have survived the first hour of. At 12:51 a.m., I want every person in Alaska who's listening to hear this from me directly. What Martin Briggs did, staying in the woods, isolating himself, preserving his lucid windows to make a call instead of walking toward the nearest lights, is what survival looks like when it's most expensive. It cost him 6 days in the Alaskan winter. It cost him everything that 6 days in that cold costs. And it may cost him more before this is over. But he didn't hurt anyone. In 28 days of Talkeetna having him, he made one decision when the decision was hardest, and he made the right one. Alaska produces people like that. I don't know how to explain it, except that the land demands it, and the people who stay become what the land demands. 12:54 a.m. Martin Briggs is walking out of the woods. Stay with us. Martin reached the Talkeetna clinic at 1:17 a.m. Ryan met him 50 yards from the building with a flashlight and a thermal blanket, which Martin initially refused because he said he didn't know what warmth would do to his cycle, and he wasn't willing to find out in proximity to other people. Ryan said he stood in the beam of the flashlight and looked at Martin for a moment, and then said, "You look like you've been in Alaska for 6 days, without a coat." Martin said, "That's accurate." Ryan said, "Come inside slowly." Martin said, "Slowly is all I've got right now." Dr. Raven met them at the clinic door. She'd been monitoring the broadcast the whole time, which meant she knew exactly what she was receiving, and she received it with the professional preparation that distinction deserved. She had the cold zone established at 42 degrees in the clinic's equipment room, which was the room farthest from the heating system, and which she'd been cooling with the door open to the November air for the past 40 minutes. She had monitoring equipment ready. She had protective gear for herself. She said she did not shake Martin's hand when he came in. She said she gestured to the equipment room and said, "In there," and he went, and she closed the door, and then she picked up her phone and called me. She said, "David, he's here. I need to tell you what I see, because what I see is not what I expected." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "He is physically deteriorated from 6 days in the cold. Frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand, on his ears, and on both feet, which is significant but not immediately life-threatening. His core temperature is 33.2 Celsius, which is mild to moderate hypothermia. His cognitive function, based on the conversation I just had with him during intake, is approximately what he described. Degraded, but coherent. The acute behavioral symptoms I'd expect at this stage of the infection are suppressed. He can describe his own condition. He can follow instructions. He knows my name and Ryan's name, and Carol's name, and yours." She paused. She said, "David, based on every case report in my database, Martin Briggs should not be able to talk to me right now." At 1:21 a.m., Dr. McIntosh and Dr. Raven were on a 3-way call, working through what Martin Briggs represented scientifically, while I broadcast the updates to Alaska and tried not to let the hope in my voice get ahead of what the data actually supported. Hope is a resource like any other. You don't spend it before you've confirmed the supply. What they agreed on by 1:26 a.m. is the following, and I want to be careful about how I present this, because these are preliminary observations from 2 doctors in extraordinary circumstances, not peer-reviewed findings, not treatment protocols, not promises. They agreed that prolonged sustained exposure to extreme cold, specifically core body temperature maintained below 34 Celsius, appears to create a modified prion propagation environment in which the acute behavioral phase is significantly suppressed. They agreed that this suppression is not a cure. The prion is present. The misfolding is occurring. But the cascade is slower, and the behavioral output is different from what's observed at normal body temperatures. They agreed that if this mechanism holds and can be replicated in controlled clinical settings, it represents the first potential therapeutic approach to outbreak management that anyone has identified. They also agreed that Martin Briggs had exactly the right biology and exactly the right terrible luck to survive in exactly the right conditions to demonstrate something that might matter enormously to how this is understood and eventually managed. At 1:29 a.m., the Guard Advance Element reached Vasilla and established their forward operating base at the Vasilla Sports Complex. 60 soldiers, initial deployment, with more coming. They've made contact with state troopers along the park's highway corridor and are beginning coordinated operations. Timeline for Guard reach into the park's highway communities north of Vasilla, 2 hours. Timeline for Titna specifically, 3 to 3.5 hours, accounting for road conditions. Ryan heard that and said, "We're good here. We don't need 3 hours of anything. We have the clinic, and we have Martin, and we have 2 rifles and Gladys Thornton. And Gladys Thornton is worth at least a platoon in my experience." At 1:33 a.m., Gladys Thornton herself called in for the first time. 69 years old, 40 years in Titna. She called to give me a situation report on Joe Mackey, the seasonal worker she'd been unable to reach earlier. She'd gone to his window instead of his door and looked in, and she'd seen enough to know what she needed to know. And she'd come home and put a chair under her door handle and made tea. She described this with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting the weather. She said, "David, I want to say something to the people listening in the small communities." I said, "Go ahead, Gladys." She said, "People from the outside think Alaska is a hard place to live because of the cold and the dark and the distance. And it is all of those things. But what it actually is, what those conditions actually produce, is people who know how to be in a room when the room is the whole world for a while. Every Alaskan knows how to be in a room with the dark outside and the cold outside and the distance outside and still function, still think, still help each other. You've been doing it your whole lives. Tonight is just another version of that. The thing outside is different. The skills you need are the same ones you already have." I let that sit on the frequency for 5 seconds without saying anything because it deserved 5 seconds. At 1:37 a.m., Thomas Akyuruk updated from Kotzebue. Confirmed contained incidents still at 11. No new acute cases in the past 90 minutes. The perimeter is holding. The weather window is forecast to open at 4 a.m., and Thomas has been in contact with the Alaska Guard through a satellite phone, and they have 2 helicopters ready to launch the moment the weather allows. He said something else that I want to share. He said, "We've been contacted by the elders. The Inupiaq community here has a tradition of managing isolation and extreme conditions that goes back generations, and the elders have been meeting since 11 p.m. They've made recommendations about community organization, resource allocation, and maintaining contact networks that are, frankly, better than anything I could have come up with from a logistics perspective. I want the outside world to understand that Alaska Native communities are not waiting to be rescued. We are managing our own crisis with our own knowledge, and we are willing to share that knowledge with whoever needs it." At 1:41 a.m., I want to take a moment and ask every person listening right now to do something small that matters to us. If you found this broadcast on YouTube, if someone sent you this link, and you've been watching from somewhere in the world while Alaska goes through tonight, please subscribe to Outbreak FM. Hit the bell. Leave a comment. Tell us which community you're in right now, which part of Alaska, which part of the world. Because one of the things this broadcast has proven tonight is that connection matters. Knowing who's out there on the other end of the frequency matters. It matters to Ryan in Titna, and it matters to Thomas in Kotzebue, and it matters to Martin Briggs in a 42-degree equipment room, who is right now the most important person in Alaska. Subscribe, comment, and if you want to support this station and what we do beyond that, the Buy Me a Coffee link is in the comments. Jake has been here since 11 p.m., and he's on his 4th coffee, and we're going to need a 5th before morning. At 1:44 a.m., the case count across Alaska was updated by the State Trooper Public Affairs Office in what was their most detailed statement. Since the original one at 11:29 p.m., confirmed incident reports across the state, 114, distributed across 17 communities. Known acute individuals, 87. The statement acknowledged for the first time publicly that the incidents appeared linked to a prime-based pathogen and advised residents to treat any violent behavior from individuals known to them as a biological hazard event requiring immediate protective distancing. The statement directed people to local emergency broadcasts for real-time updates. Local emergency broadcasts. Jake looked at me and raised his eyebrow, and I said, "Yeah, I know. 114 incidents across 17 communities. 87 acute individuals in a state of 663,000 square miles, most of which has no roads. The number sounds manageable until you map it against the geography and the darkness and the cold, and the communities with no connection to anything except the signal that comes out of this building on 92.1 FM. And it sounds exactly as hard as it is. At 1:48 a.m., Dr. Raven reported that Martin Briggs had asked her something through the equipment room door. He'd asked, "Is there any chance I come out of this? Not survive the night. Out of this entirely. Is there any version of this story where Martin Briggs goes home?" Dr. McIntosh and Dr. Raven conferred for 90 seconds. Then Dr. Raven went to the door and said, "Martin, we don't know yet. What we know is that you've given us information tonight that we didn't have before, and that information might help us develop answers. We are going to work as fast as the science allows, and we are going to tell you everything we find. That's what we can promise right now." Martin said, "That's honest. I can work with honest. So can we, Martin. So can we." At 2:03 a.m., the aurora borealis appeared over Titna. Ryan mentioned it almost as an aside, the way Alaskans mention the aurora, with the casual appreciation of people who have lived under it long enough that it doesn't interrupt the sentence so much as accompany it. He said, "The northern lights just came out, green and a little pink tonight." And then he kept talking about the situation, the clinic, Carol, Martin, the community, all of it, with the aurora visible through the clinic's front window behind him. I put that on the frequency because people needed to hear it, not as contrast or irony, as context. The aurora is there every clear night in November. It doesn't know what's happening below it. The lights don't pause for human events. They don't frame them. They don't comment on them. They just run their ancient electromagnetic choreography above a landscape that has been enduring human events for 10,000 years and will endure them for 10,000 more. There's something in that which helps, if you let it. I let it. At 2:07 a.m., the case information from the park's highway corridor had been reorganized by Jake with the state trooper data and what we'd compiled from callers. And the picture it shows is this. The outbreak spread from a point of origin in the Cantwell area, moved through Earl Briggs to Titna, and also moved through the cargo flight route to the bush communities, suggesting two parallel transmission vectors operating simultaneously. The highway vector is geographically traceable and follows movement patterns between connected communities. The air vector is more complex because it moved faster and in multiple directions and reached communities that the highway vector couldn't have reached. The air vector is the more dangerous one because small planes in Alaska go everywhere, and they go frequently, and they carry people between communities the way buses carry people between neighborhoods in other states. If anyone on any of those flights in the past 3 weeks was in an early incubation phase and distributed themselves across the Alaska flight network, the potential reach of the initial exposure is much wider than the 17 communities currently confirmed. At 2:11 a.m., I made a call I'd been thinking about for an hour. I called KYUK in Bethel, which is the radio station serving western Alaska and which broadcasts in both English and Yupik. I got through to their overnight operator, a young woman named Sophie, who knew exactly why I was calling and had already been monitoring our frequency. She said they'd been preparing their own emergency broadcast for the past 40 minutes, had been waiting to confirm information before going live, and were going on air in approximately 15 minutes. I told her everything we had. I told her about the incubation window and the cold suppression data from Martin Briggs and the cargo route vector and Thomas Akiruk's community management approach in Kotzebue. She wrote all of it down, and then she said, "David, we have communities in western Alaska who may not know anything about this yet. They listen to KYUK. We're going to make sure they know." 2 radio stations, covering different regions of the largest state in the country, running parallel emergency broadcasts through the night. Jake heard me describe that afterward and said, "That's what it's supposed to look like. That's exactly what it's supposed to look like." At 2:15 a.m., something happened in Titna that I need to describe carefully because it's the most complicated thing of the night in human terms, even though in tactical terms, it was relatively brief. Joe Mackey, the seasonal worker whose lights were on and whose movement Gladys had heard through his window earlier in the night, was found by Ryan when he did a perimeter check at 2:12 a.m. Joe was outside, not in the acute phase, or at least not fully. He was standing in the parking area behind his cabin, approximately 100 yards from the clinic, standing in the -7-degree dark, and apparently not aware of the cold, or at least not responding to it in a way that suggested he was experiencing it as an emergency. Ryan said over the line, very quietly, "I've got eyes on Joe Mackey. He's standing in the lot behind his place. He's not moving toward me. He might not see me yet." I said, "Ryan, what's your assessment?" He said, "I've known Joe for 2 winters. He's not a permanent resident, but he's a known quantity. Right now he's standing in -7 in a flannel shirt looking at the sky, and I don't know if he's looking at the aurora or looking at nothing." I said, "Can you reach Dr. Raven through the clinic door without getting closer to Joe?" He said, "I'm going to try." What happened in the next 11 minutes I know from Ryan's narration in fragments, because he was whispering and moving and couldn't always have the phone to his ear. But the summary is this: Dr. Raven, through the clinic's exterior intercom, spoke to Joe Mackey from inside the building for 8 minutes. She spoke to him like he was a person who could hear her, which he was, at least partially. She spoke to him about Titna, about the clinic, about Martin in the equipment room, and what Martin had done by staying in the woods, and what that meant. She spoke slowly and without alarm, and with the specific tone that medical professionals develop over years of talking to people in crisis, the tone that says, "I see you, and I'm not afraid of you, and you don't have to be what you're afraid you've become." At 2:24 a.m., Joe Mackey walked through the clinic's exterior door when Dr. Raven opened it. He's in a separate cold space now, a supply closet with the window open. Dr. Raven is monitoring him alongside Martin, 2 people in Titna, population 28, who are managing the worst thing that can happen to a person in one of the worst places in the world for it to happen, and who are being managed by a wilderness medicine physician who came to this tiny clinic from a residency in Boston because she wanted to do medicine that mattered. At 2:28 a.m., Jake handed me a note. It said, "CDC Atlanta is on the line. They've been monitoring the broadcast. Want to talk to Dr. McIntosh and Dr. Raven directly." At 2:29 a.m., I put CDC Atlanta in contact with UA and the Titna clinic and stepped back from that call to let the scientists do what scientists need to do, which is talk to each other without a radio host in the middle. That conversation is ongoing, and I don't have access to it, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I have access to is the frequency and the callers in Alaska going through the night. At 2:33 a.m., the weather window opened over Kotzebue. 40 minutes ahead of the 4 a.m. forecast, the wind dropped enough for aviation, and Thomas Akyaruk heard the guard helicopter before he saw its lights. He called in at 2:37 a.m. to say, "They're here." He said it with the same steady matter-of-factness he'd maintained all night, but underneath it, in the way that matter-of-factness sometimes contains everything else, you could hear what 2.5 hours of holding a community perimeter above the Arctic Circle in -44 wind chill, and knowing help was 4 hours away, had cost him. He said, "They're here." And then he said, "Tell Martin that Kotzebue held." "I'll tell him, Thomas." At 2:41 a.m., the Guard Parks highway deployment reached Trapper Creek and Big Lake and established secured positions at both communities. Medical personnel are being air inserted into the more remote communities. The state trooper encrypted channel, which Jake monitors, but which I'm not going to detail the contents of, is showing increased coordination, and what sounds like the organized response starting to find its shape after 3 hours of reactive operations. 3 hours of reactive. Now the response starts to move instead of just react. At 2:45 a.m., I want to tell you something about what's happened in this building since 11 p.m. Jake Peterson has been at his board for 3 hours and 45 minutes. He hasn't eaten. He's had, by actual count, 6 coffees. He has been managing incoming calls, monitoring 5 separate radio channels, coordinating information with me in real time, maintaining contact with our sister stations, and doing all of this with the quiet competence of someone who understands that his job tonight is to make sure that every person in Alaska who needs this frequency can reach it, and that this building keeps broadcasting for as long as Alaska needs it to. Jake doesn't like being talked about on air. He's told me that twice. I'm doing it anyway, because the people who keep the signal alive deserve to be named. At 2:48 a.m., Ryan told me something from Titna that I've been sitting with since, and that I'm going to share now, because this broadcast isn't just about tactics and case counts and scientific data. It's about what actually happens to people in these hours. He said, Carol has been sitting next to the equipment room door for the past hour, not doing anything, not saying anything, just sitting next to the door where Pete went in. I asked her if she needed anything. She said she needed to be near the door, so I let her be near the door. And I thought about all the doors tonight. The door Elena Cruz held in Fort Worth. The door Patricia Nguyen organized 47 people behind in the livestock exchange. The staff corridor door in Tempe. The equipment room door in Titna, where Martin Briggs is and where Pete Svensson isn't. The doors between people and everything that's outside tonight. And all the people holding vigil next to them. At 2:52 a.m., the aurora shifted color. Ryan said it had gone from green and pink to white and violet and was moving in the way it moves when the solar wind is doing something particularly active, the kind of display that people drive hours and sleep in parking lots to see. He said, "It looks like something from another world." I said, "You're looking at plasma from the sun hitting our magnetosphere." He said, "Yeah, I know what it is." It still looks like something from another world. It does, Ryan. It still does. At 3:01 a.m., Dr. Raven came on the line from Talkeetna with the update that the CDC team in Atlanta had specifically asked her to share publicly, which is itself significant. The fact that Atlanta wanted it on this frequency tells me they understand that this broadcast is where Alaska is listening. She said, Martin Briggs's core temperature has been gradually adjusted over the past 2 hours from 33.2 Celsius to 34.8 Celsius, a rise of 1.6 degrees achieved slowly and under controlled monitoring. At the 1 degree mark, his acute behavioral symptoms increased noticeably. He became more agitated, less verbal, required coaching to maintain coherent conversation. At 34.8, he is at the threshold where the suppression effect appears to begin degrading. This provides a provisional data point. Sustained core temperature below 34 Celsius correlates with significant behavioral suppression. The CDC has characterized this as the most clinically significant data point identified in this outbreak to date. She paused. Then she said, Martin heard me say that. He asked me to tell you that he's glad 6 days in the woods was good for something. At 3:05 a.m., the Alaska case picture, as assembled by Jake from all available sources, looked like this. Confirmed incidents across the state, 147. Confirmed acute individuals, 109. Contained by community action, guard, or law enforcement, 83. Remaining active and uncontained, 26. Predominantly in the more remote communities where response is still traveling. The anchorage incidents at the port had been resolved with law enforcement. No breach into the broader city population. The guard was operational in the Matsu Valley and moving north on the Parks Highway. The Kotzebue situation was actively supported by guard helicopter assets now that the weather window was open. 147 incidents in Alaska. In a state of 733,000 people across 663,000 square miles. Less than 0.02% of the population in active incident status. The math sounds manageable. The geography makes the math irrelevant because 0.02% distributed across remote communities with no roads enclosing weather windows and populations of 28 is not 0.02% of a city. It's everything to the communities that contain it. At 3:09 a.m., Ryan reported that guard advance units had reached the outskirts of Titna ahead of schedule. He could see the headlights on the park's highway from the clinic window, which he described as the most welcome set of headlights he'd ever seen. And Ryan Callahan has been watching headlights on Park's highway for 11 years, so that's a meaningful comparison. He said Carol stood up when she saw the lights and went to the window and put her hand on the glass. The guard medic who entered the clinic at 3:14 a.m. was a woman named Sergeant Torres, who introduced herself to Dr. Raven, reviewed the Martin Briggs documentation that Dr. Raven had been compiling all night, and said, "Ma'am, are you military?" Dr. Raven said no. Sergeant Torres said, "The CDC is going to want to talk to you for a very long time." Dr. Raven said, "I know, but right now I have 2 patients, and Martin needs monitoring and Joe needs assessment, and Carol Svensson needs something I can't provide, but maybe you can." Sergeant Torres went and sat with Carol. At 3:17 a.m., Jake received a text from a number he didn't recognize that said, "This is Thomas Aguiruk. The guard is here. Kotzebue is secure. Tell David that the elders say a radio that talks all night through the dark is the same as a fire that burns all night in the dark. The purpose is the same." Jake showed me the screen. I read it on air because it deserved to be on air. A fire that burns all night in the dark. Yeah, that's it exactly. At 3:21 a.m., the Alaska State Troopers updated their public statement for the 3rd time tonight. And for the first time, the statement included substantive information rather than procedural direction. It acknowledged the prion-based nature of the pathogen, confirmed the cargo route transmission vector, acknowledged the Denali Borough origin cluster, and directed Alaskans to continue sheltering in place until community-level clearances could be issued by Guard and Trooper units. It also, for the first time, acknowledged the cold suppression data from the Titna clinic by name, describing it as promising preliminary findings with clinical significance that federal authorities were assessing. The Titna clinic, population 28, Dr. Elise Raven, wilderness medicine, formerly of Boston. Martin Briggs, 62 years old, 6 days in the woods, 60% functional. Named in an Alaska State Trooper public statement at 3:21 a.m. as the source of the most clinically significant data in the outbreak. At 3:25 a.m., I asked Ryan something I'd been meaning to ask since the beginning of the night and hadn't found the moment for. I said, "Ryan, when you first heard about this tonight, when you first got Carol's call about Pete, before you knew anything about what you were dealing with, what did you actually think was happening?" He said, "Honestly, I thought Pete had been drinking and got stupid and bit someone. That happens. This is a small town in Alaska, and sometimes people make bad decisions in winter. I was annoyed when I went over there. I thought it was going to be a domestic management situation, and I was going to have to smooth some feathers and get home by midnight." He paused. He said, "I was wrong about that." At 3:29 a.m., Jake has been making calls for the past hour on a specific thread that I want to tell you about, because it represents the thing that happens after the immediate crisis stabilizes, the thing that everyone does in parallel with the crisis management, but that only surfaces when there's enough space to name it. Jake has been trying to find out about the communities along the cargo route at Thomas First. Mentioned Galena, McGrath, Aniak. He's reached 2 out of 3. Galena was the hardest hit, with confirmed incidents involving 12 of its 470 residents, and the community had managed itself throughout the night in a way that Galena historically manages things, which is quietly and without outside prompting. McGrath reported 3 incidents, all contained. Aniak, the 3rd community, is not answering any contact method Jake has tried, and the one person he reached in a neighboring community who has family in Aniak said they hadn't heard from their relatives since this afternoon. Jake is still trying Aniak. I'm going to keep telling you that until we know. At 3:33 a.m., Gladys Thornton called in for the second and final time. She said, "David, I'm going to bed now. The guard is here. Ryan is at the clinic. Everything in this town that needed doing tonight has been done. I'm 80. I'm not 74, like I told someone earlier. I've been 80 for 2 years, and I don't know why I keep forgetting that, and I need my sleep." She said, "You did a good job tonight. Tell Jake the same." She hung up. Gladys Thornton, 80 years old, 40 years in Titna, who locked her door against Alaskan nights before Ryan Callahan was born, and who sat quietly through tonight, being exactly as useful as she needed to be, and not one bit more dramatic about it. She went to bed. At 3:37 a.m., I want to speak to something I haven't addressed directly yet, because I've been in broadcast mode all night, and broadcast mode doesn't always leave room for the human accounting. Tonight, across Alaska, people died. I don't have confirmed numbers, and I won't have them tonight, because Alaska is large and dark, and the accounting takes time. But people died. In communities I named, and communities I didn't name. In situations we tracked, and situations that were over before we knew about them. In some of those situations, the outcome was different from what it could have been, because someone had a radio on. In some of them it wasn't, and no radio in the world was going to change it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. This broadcast matters, and it doesn't matter enough. It's a radio station, and the people who needed more than a radio station tonight deserved more than a radio station tonight. I can say that plainly and still believe that what we did here mattered, because both things are true simultaneously, and pretending otherwise in either direction is dishonest. At 3:41 a.m., Jake got through to Aniak. A teenager named Cassie, 16 years old, answered the community center phone, where Jake had been calling repeatedly for an hour. She said, "Sorry, we've been kind of busy." She said her community had managed an incident at the airstrip 4 hours ago when a flight came in from McGrath, and that she'd been helping the adults organize a shelter situation in the community center, and nobody had been monitoring the phone. She said, "We're okay. We're all okay." She said it with the particular confidence of 16-year-olds who have been useful during a crisis and know it. Jake exhaled. He'd been holding something tight for an hour, and he let it go when Cassie said they were okay. At 3:45 a.m., the temperature in Titna was -9. The aurora was still running, white and violet, the solar display ongoing regardless of everything below it. Martin Briggs was in a 42-degree equipment room at the Titna clinic, core temperature maintained at 33.8. Cognitive function Dr. Raven was describing as stable. CDC medical team arriving by helicopter at first light to continue observation and documentation. Joe Mackey was in a supply closet with the window open, monitored, contained, not yet as coherent as Martin, but showing the same cold suppression pattern that suggested the mechanism was real and consistent. Carol Svensson was in the clinic waiting room with Sergeant Torres. Ryan Callahan was on the clinic porch looking at the aurora. Dr. Elise Raven was at her desk writing up the night's clinical observations, with the focused urgency of someone who understands that what she's writing is going to matter to people she'll never meet. Gladys Thornton was asleep. Thomas Akuruk was in Kotzebue, surrounded by guard and surrounded by his community's elders, and surrounded by the vast dark of the Arctic, and Kotzebue held. Cassie in Aniak was 16 years old and had helped organize a crisis shelter and answered the phone when Jake called. At 3:49 a.m., Jake made his coffee count 7 and looked at me and said, "You should say the thing." I said, "What thing?" He said, "The thing that ends it right. You know what it is." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about Ryan and the aurora, and Martin's thumb up emoji, and Thomas's fire in the dark, and Gladys going to bed, and Carol's hand on the glass, and Dr. Raven naming what she had, and the CDC asking to share it publicly, and Cassie saying we're okay, we're all okay, Sorry, we've been busy. I thought about KYUK going on air in Yupik, so the communities of Western Alaska could hear it in the language they think in when things get serious. I thought about the cargo route and the 17 communities and the 14,000-mile road system in 663,000 square miles of the most difficult and beautiful and demanding landscape in the United States. At 3:53 a.m., I said what Jake meant. I said, Alaska is not a place that waits for someone else to handle it. It never has been. The people who stayed here, the people whose families have been here for 10,000 years, and the people who came and decided to stay, all of them learned the same thing in different ways. This land does not give you anything you don't earn, and it does not apologize for what it demands. What it does is produce people who can handle what it demands. People who lock their doors before they're asked to, and make tea, and sit next to closed doors and text thumbs-up emojis from snow shelters, and answer phones after crisis shelters, and hold community perimeters above the Arctic Circle in 44 below wind chill, and still say, we're okay. Alaska held tonight, not because rescue came fast enough, because Alaska doesn't wait for rescue. It holds until rescue can catch up. At 3:57 a.m., I'm going to keep this frequency on until morning. Jake is going to keep his board running. The calls are going to keep coming, and we're going to take every one of them. If you're somewhere in Alaska right now, and you need to be heard, call in. If you're somewhere in the world watching this later, subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are. Tell us what the night looked like from where you sat. And if this broadcast was the fire in the dark that kept you company through tonight, we're glad it was here. We're glad Jake drove in at 11 p.m. We're glad Dr. McIntosh stayed on the line. We're glad Ryan moved the bookshelf. We're glad Martin Briggs spent 6 days in the woods because he knew what he was and chose not to let it touch anyone else. We're glad Gladys is 80 and not 74 and went to bed when she needed to. At 4:01 a.m., the aurora ran green and white and violet over Titna and over Kotzebue and over Aniak and over every dark mile of Alaska that had gone through the night on its own terms and was still going. This is KWAV 92.1 FM, Anchorage. Hello, listener. Alaska is still here. So are we. We'll be here when you wake up.